When it came to crucifixions, the Romans certainly knew what they were doing. Carefully planned physical torture, public humiliation, and political messaging all rolled together in one and carried out by professionals. A team of soldiers, battle-hardened and used to killing people, who would be under the command of an experienced officer. And we know in the case of Jesus that was a centurion. For us, when we think about the gory details of a crucifixion, we find that very hard. For Jesus' mother, who we know from the other Gospels was stood there at the cross, it must have been horrific. But for the soldiers, this was really just routine procedure. And so I think it's very surprising what we read there in verse 54 on page 1000. When the centurion and those with him who were guarding Jesus saw the earthquake and all that had happened, they were terrified and exclaimed, "Surely he was the Son of God." The Greek words, there's two words, one that means to fear, and the other one very or extremely or greatly. So the old King James Bible translated as they feared greatly. The same two words used when Peter and James and John went up the mountain and Jesus was transfigured and the cloud enveloped them and the voice spoke from heaven. It says they fell face down to the ground, terrified. The same kind of fear going on in the centurion and the soldiers. But why? Because Jesus by this point is dead. What is there for these hardened soldiers to fear? And Matthew tells us that, of course, as they were standing there, an earthquake has struck Jerusalem. The ground had shaken, the rocks had split. I've never experienced an earthquake, but those who have talk about how terrifying it is when the one thing that always remains solid, the ground, you suddenly can't depend on anymore. You know how you step off a boat and you're glad to be back on solid ground, or you come off a rickety bridge. But when the solid ground is no longer solid, it is terrifying, as the people of Burma will have discovered the last couple of days. But it wasn't just the earthquake. It says in verse 54, it was the earthquake and all that had happened. What else had happened? We'd had 3 hours of darkness in the middle of the day, Jesus crying out, and no doubt the way that he died with the self-control that he had. And so this centurion with his soldiers decides that Jesus must be the Son of God. Perhaps he's remembering how he and his men had been mocking Jesus just a few hours before, dressing Jesus up in a purple robe and a crown of thorns and bowing down before him, hailing him as king. And now they declare out loud that this man surely was the Son of God. They've had to rethink who their prisoner is. What does the centurion mean when he says, Son of God? The Jews, of course, knew that there was only one God and that he's the creator and we're his creatures. And although they did sometimes, I think they were taught to think of their kings as sons of God, but they certainly would never be claiming that a man was God. That would be blasphemy. But the centurion is not a Jew. The centurion is a Roman, and they worship many gods, and they believe that male gods could have children by human women. And so when he says Son of God, it could just mean surely this man was a son of one of the gods. That's possible, and of course the gospel writers do often record the words of people who are saying things that are more true than they really know. The centurion may just mean this man who died must have been somebody special. But of course, he has listened to what people have been saying about this man on the cross. So if you just turn back to verse 39, Those who passed by hurled insults at Jesus, shaking their heads and saying, "You who are going to destroy the temple and build it in 3 days, save yourself. Come down from the cross if you are the Son of God." There's no doubt then that they heard that Jesus or someone has been claiming that he is the Son of God. This prisoner of theirs, it had been said that he was the Son of God. And put that together with the 3 hours of darkness in the middle of the day. And we know this was not an eclipse. An eclipse happens at the new moon, when the moon is barely visible. But Passover always happened at the full moon, and the crucifixion of Jesus took place at Passover. So it wasn't an eclipse. We're not told what it was, but three hours of darkness in the middle of the day. And so terrified, they exclaimed, surely this wasn't an ordinary man. Surely he must have been the Son of God. I think we can take the centurion's example for ourselves. It's good to stand at the cross, as it were, to look, to see in awe. Perhaps in the next couple of weeks as we lead up to Easter, you might like to read Matthew 26 and 27 again. We've preached through those chapters very slowly, week by week, but to go back and just read them, perhaps in one sitting, those 2 chapters, I think would be a good way of doing this, of taking time to stand at the cross and look in awe. And of course, the services that we have on Maundy, Thursday and Good Friday are an opportunity to do that, to take that time to pause at the cross. But it's not just what the centurion might have thought, because Matthew tells us more. And I want to go back to verse 45 and think about the death of God. Verse 45, from the 6th hour until the 9th hour. The 6th hour was noon, because they would start counting their hours each day from sunrise, in other words, from 6 o'clock in the morning. So the 6th hour is noon, and the 9th hour is 3 o'clock in the afternoon. So from noon to 3 o'clock in the afternoon, darkness came over all the land. About the 9th hour, Jesus cried out in a loud voice, "Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani," which means, my God, why have you forsaken me?" When some of those standing there heard this, they said, "He's calling Elijah." Immediately one of them ran and got a sponge. He filled it with wine vinegar, put it on a stick, and offered it to Jesus to drink. The rest said, "Now leave him alone. Let's see if Elijah comes to save him." So we don't know what the mechanism is by which the world went dark, or this part of the world went dark for 3 hours. But we do know from the Old Testament that darkness is a sign of God's displeasure and judgment. The prophets often spoke of a day of the Lord, which would be a day of darkness. So, for example, Amos says, "Will not the day of the Lord be darkness, not light, pitch dark, without a ray of brightness?" And in Amos 8, it says, "In that day, declares the sovereign Lord, I will make the sun go down at noon and darken the earth in broad daylight." Some people have said the darkness represents the judgment of God falling on Jesus. God's wrath at sin, not of course Jesus' sin, but our sin laid on him. And I think that's possible. But verse 45 says the darkness came over all the land. And so I actually think that the darkness represents more the judgment of God on the land. In other words, on Israel. This is the people that has rejected her Lord, her bridegroom, her God. This is the land that has put to death her God. You might say, you talk about God dying, but can God die? And in one sense, God, of course, doesn't ever die. The throne of heaven is never empty. And yet Jesus is God, and Jesus did die. So what we probably need to say is that according to his human nature, the Son of God died on the cross. And when you put it that way, this is incredible, awful, almost unbelievable. Jesus' life, of course, is not taken from him. He said that it would never be taken from him, but he would lay down his life. He gives up his spirit in verse 50. He's in control of his destiny, even in death, but he does die as the Son of God. He suffers more than physical death, and we see that in that cry in verse 46, which translated is, my God, why have you forsaken me?" That's the first words from Psalm 22. Psalm 22 says, my God, why have you forsaken me? Why are you so far from saving me, so far from the words of my groaning?" That's the same psalm, of course, and we've read it in recent weeks, the same psalm that talks about they mock me, they hurl insults, they shake their heads. The psalm that talks about all my bones are out of joint, my heart has turned to wax. The psalm that says they divide my garments among them and cast lots for my clothing. It's the psalm that more than any other seems to be speaking about a person who's going through something like what Jesus goes through on the cross, and that's why Jesus quotes it. Jesus speaks in Aramaic saying, Eloi or Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani, and some of them standing there say he's calling Elijah. And Eli, my God, does sound like Elijah. But surely they recognize the first line of Psalm 22, don't they? Is it that they don't want to admit that Jesus is the king in David's line? Is that why they, instead of going with Psalm 22, they say, oh, he must be calling for Elijah? Is it that they don't want to accept that this man who they're crucifying is actually the Messiah, the Christ, who fulfills the words of David's psalm? And Jesus, as he quotes those words, gives us a bit of a glimpse into what he's going through. Yes, he's still the Son of the Father. The Trinity's not broken while Jesus hangs on the cross. And yet, in a deeply mysterious way, Jesus was cut off from the favor of the Father, cut off from fellowship with the Father that he'd always enjoyed for all eternity. If we stand in awe and wonder at the physical suffering of Jesus on the cross, then we should wonder even more at this. Jesus bearing sin, our sin, enduring God's wrath at sin, and therefore calling out, my God, why have you forsaken me? He went through this so that we don't have to, because in many ways, this is hell, isn't it? Being cut off from God, our Creator, forever. Being cut off from every good thing because God is the source of every good thing. If you like, hell is to cry forever, my God, why have you forsaken me? And I think also that Jesus cries out in the words of Psalm 22 because that psalm is not just about the suffering of David, it's also a psalm that speaks about victory. If you like, it's not just about the cross, but it points to the resurrection. At the end of Psalm 22, David says, for he has not despised or disdained the suffering of the afflicted one. He's not hidden his face from him, but has listened to his cry for help. So we thank God for the cross. If our trust is fully in Jesus who died there, then we need not ever experience the terror of being God forsaken as Jesus did on the cross on our behalf. We've thought about darkness, we've thought about the cry, and then finally, in the last little bit, Matthew talks about some other things that happened. So, just as Jesus dies, as he gives up his spirit, have a look at what happens in verse 51. At that moment, the curtain of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. The earth shook and the rocks split. The tombs broke open and the bodies of many holy people who had died were raised to life. They came out of the tombs, and after Jesus' resurrection, they went into the holy city and appeared to many people. So as Jesus dies, the curtain in the temple is torn from top to bottom, maybe caused by the earthquake, maybe in some other way. That curtain was huge. It was apparently about 60 feet high. So imagine a person at 6 foot-ish. 10 times that is the height of this curtain in the temple, and Josephus says it was 4 inches thick. I don't know how you make a curtain that's 4 inches thick. I think it needs a lot of thread, but this vast curtain in the temple was a big no entry sign. It blocked the way into the most holy place, the Holy of Holies, the place where, if you like, God was living. The holy God. It's saying, you can't come in here. You can't come in here because it's not safe for anyone to come in here because of our sin. But as Jesus dies on the cross bearing our sin, that curtain is torn. And you see what that's saying? The way is open now. We can draw near to God without fear. There's the curtain, there's the earthquake. Fairly common in Judea to have earthquakes, but this one coinciding with the moment of Jesus' death. Just like the darkness, it feels like it's an appropriate thing to happen. For God to shake the land as his people put his son to death. And we have this very strange thing happening in verse 52. Only Matthew, I think, talks about this. The dead people coming out of the tombs. Dead believers rising again. I'm not quite sure about the timing because it talks about the earthquake happening when Jesus dies, but then it talks about these people rising and going into the holy city, into Jerusalem, after Jesus has been raised, which of course is on the 3rd day. There were 2 earthquakes. There was an earthquake at the time of the crucifixion and another earthquake at the time of the resurrection. But whatever the timing, I think you can imagine the impact this had when suddenly some people who trusted in God return to the city of Jerusalem at the same time that people are talking about seeing Jesus alive again. And the point is that Jesus is triumphing over sin and death, and that's not just him rising from death. It's something that will result in new resurrection life for everyone who trusts in him. And these people who've been raised seem to be like the first signs of that. We don't know what happened to them after this. We don't know how long they continue to live or what they continue to do, but they are a powerful sign that Jesus' death and resurrection is going to cause that gift of resurrection to come to others as well. So we thank God for all that we see here in this passage. We thank God for the cross of Jesus. We know that he was tempted to walk away from this, but he didn't. He persevered and he suffered for us. He says that we are to trust in him, to trust in his death, for us to trust him for new life and for forgiveness. And of course, he says we are to take up our cross and to follow Jesus. We are to die to our old self and live for him. And having read this, we have a much better idea what it means to take up your cross. It means to expect to be treated like Jesus, to lose our life like Jesus, so that we can find new resurrection life in him. What was it that led that centurion and those executioners to suddenly declare that Jesus must be the Son of God? All the things that happened as Jesus suffered and died, put together, I think, convince them that he was the Son of God, and show us why this day, the darkest of days, is Good Friday, and why it's right to call it Good Friday. So what do? We stand and we look in awe as we see the Son of God giving up his life for us. We thank God for the cross. We realize what a God-forsaken destiny would mean for people. And we thank God that in Jesus we have a way to not go through that. And we take up our cross and we follow Jesus. Shall we pray?